Welcome to Syntax, a Generative Introduction, 4th edition. My name is Andrew Carnie. I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Arizona. I'm the author of your textbook, and I'll be leading you through this series of video tutorials. Back in Chapter 9, we talked about a kind of construction called raising. This was a case where you had a DP that was in an embedded clause which couldn't get case there, primarily because the embedded clause was non-finite and the specifier of its TP would not be a case position. But what happened in these cases is that that DP would raise to a higher clause to the specifier of the matrix or main clause TP where it would get case. In this chapter, we're going to look at these sentences again. But we're also going to contrast them with sentences that look very similar on the surface, but don't in fact involve raising. These are called control sentences. So let's look at some surprising parallels. First of all, we have the pattern that we have already seen back in the chapter on DP movement. Jean is likely to leave. Now if we think about the thematic properties of this, Jean is getting a theta roll from leave, and not from is likely. So it isn't that Jean is likely. Jean's leaving is likely. Jean is doing the leaving. So in this sentence, we argued that the Jean starts as the subject of the verb leave in the embedded clause, and then moves up to become the subject of the main clause via an operation of DP movement called raising. Now if you look at the next sentence, this looks extremely similar, right? We have a noun, we have the copular verb, we have an adjective or adverb, and then we have a non-finite clause that follows. So you would think that these two sentences really involve the same set of phenomena. But if you think about the meaning of the second sentence, Jean is reluctant to leave, there's actually an important difference here. That difference is that Jean is, first of all, an argument of leaving, just like the raising sentence, but it also seems to get a theta roll from reluctant. So Jean appears to take an experiencer role from reluctant and an agent role from leave. So Jean is in fact reluctant in ways that Jean is not likely. This in and of itself, right, is a violation of the theta criterion, which is one thing that we will have to deal with, because Jean appears to be getting two theta rolls, an experiencer from reluctant and an agent from leave. That shouldn't be possible. So the thematic properties of the raising sentence and the control sentence are quite different from one another. Control is the name of sentences like this. Now there's another set of sentences that are parallel. We are going to discuss these in more detail in a subsequent video, but I want to draw them to your attention right now. These are sentences like Jean wants Brian to leave and Jean persuaded Brian to leave. These involve a different kind of raising that we haven't discussed before, called subject to object raising, where you're moving from the embedded clause into the object position of the main clause. The reason we didn't do this before is because we didn't have a case position that could host this element. But in the theory that we have developed for double object constructions, we actually have a position we can move this element into. So this case, what you will notice is Brian is behaving in some ways like the object of want. If we were to change this to a pronoun, it would be an accusative case. Jean wants him to leave. So in some ways this is behaving like an object, but it is not the theme of want. Jean wants Brian to leave does not mean that Jean wants Brian. So Brian is not getting a theta roll from want, but it is getting a theta roll from leave. Contrast that with the control sentence. Here again, Brian is doing the leaving, so Brian is the agent of leaving, but Jean persuaded Brian. Brian is being persuaded. So Brian is getting a theta roll from persuade. What it looks like here, again, is a violation of the theta criterion. Brian is getting two theta rolls. It's the agent of leave, and it's the theme of persuade. That should be impossible. So first of all, we're going to primarily in this video look at these two sentences here, the subject to subject raising, that's this first sentence, and the subject control, which is the second sentence. And we'll learn how to distinguish these two cases and figure out how we would represent them so that we don't violate the theta criterion. Then in the next video, we will address these object control and subject to object raising sentences. Okay, so first of all, let's review is likely, a raising predicate. You could stick in any number of raising predicates here, but is likely has the property that it has one required argument. That's an embedded clause. That shows up three different ways. There's three different ways that this theta grid can be realized. The first one is with what is called an extraposition sentence. This is just a fancy name for the case where you have the embedded clause in the complement to the adjective or adverb, and you have an expletive in the subject position. So that expletive plus clausal complement is called extraposition. It is likely that John will leave. That's one variety. The it is an expletive, so it's not reflected in the theta grid. That clause is the thing that gets the theta roll in this theta grid. Another option is to have this clause functioning as the subject of the sentence. That John will leave is likely. And in that case, this clause is directly in the specifier of the copular is or of the tense node, more likely. So this is functioning as the subject. And again, it reflects the single theta roll implemented by is likely. The third variety is the variety we talked about at length in chapter 10, which is subject to subject raising. So the DP is generated as the subject of this embedded clause, but this embedded clause, unlike the other two, is a non-finite clause. So there's no case position in the specifier of this TP. By contrast, in these two constructions, the embedded clause is finite, so the subject can get case inside of it. So this subject in the non-finite clause is caseless, so it's going to have to move to get case. And it does so by moving into the subject position of is likely. So John starts here and it moves up here. John does not get a theta roll from is likely. It's not consistent with the theta grid, but it does get its case in this position. And the EPP is satisfied as well. So raising predicates, subject to subject raising predicates, have these three different constructions that are possible. And they're possible primarily because there's only a single argument, which is the clause. And then the subjecthood relationship, the EPP, if you like, is realized in three different ways. In extraposition, you insert an expletive. With the clausal subject, you actually move the whole clause into the subject position. And in subject to subject raising, you take the subject of the embedded clause and move it. So let's trace that out in terms of trees. Here we have the tree for an extraposition construction. We've put the verb is in as a V. It's a copular V. I've indicated V to T movement here because remember, in English, the highest auxiliary verb, and we're going to treat this like an auxiliary verb, raises into the T node. Remember, that's motivated by the fact that if we were to make this a question, the T to C movement would invert it. So we're going to do that little hop. And we have likely being some kind of adjective or adverb phrase. I've just abbreviated it here as A, which takes as a complement the finite clause that Jean left. Now, in order to meet the EPP constraints here, we're going to do expletive insertion. So we insert an expletive it into the specifier of this TP, and that gives us the well-formed extraposition sentence, it is likely that Jean left. The clausal subject construction is slightly different. Tree is otherwise the same, but we're going to meet the EPP a different way. Rather than inserting an expletive into this position, we're going to move that clausal complement into the specifier of the TP. We do this movement primarily for the EPP. We don't have to do it for case because CPs don't require case. I will say that there is not all raising verbs allow the clausal subject constraint. So for example, construction. So for example, the verb seem is a raising verb, and it is odd to say things like that Jean left seems. It's possible, but it's not the most normal situation. It's much more likely to say it seems that Jean left. So not all raising predicates allow this movement of a clausal complement into subject position, but it is a typical property of raising predicates. Our third option is raising. Remember this is just something that we covered in chapter 11. We have an embedded clause here, this CP, and that embedded clause has within it a non-finite t, and the rest of the sentence, John leaves. John is generated in the specifier of the voice phrase because it's an agent. It's going to try and find a case because this is not a case position. Specifier of voice is not a case position. Now the specifier of 2 is also not a case position, but we're going to move it to that position anyway. And the reason we do that is because the EPP requires that this position be filled. So we do a movement into this position. Also, doing this movement will allow us to not violate the minimal link condition, which says you have to do everything in small hops. But the DP can't stay here. And the reason it can't stay here is because this is not a case position either. So it's got to continue on its voyage, and it's going to go up to the specifier of the highest TP right here. And in this position, it can get nominative case from the finite tense of the main clause, and it also satisfies the EPP property of this TP. So that's the most complicated case, but it is a one we've seen before. So how do we distinguish these kinds of constructions from constructions like is reluctant? So you remember that we started this video with the observation that in is reluctant, there actually is an external theta role. So if I say John is reluctant to leave, John is experiencing reluctance. So it is in fact getting this experiencer role. If I say John is likely to leave, John is not an experiencer of is likely. Right? It only gets a theta role from the embedded verb. So is reluctant is similar to is likely in that it takes a CP complement, but it also has this external theta role. Now there are several tests we can use to determine whether something is subject to subject raising or subject control. The first thing you can do is work out the theta grids. So just as we did a minute ago, control constructions involve an external theta role. Second thing you can do is you can check to see whether it allows an expletive subject or not. Expletive subjects are only allowed in raising constructions because these are non-thematic positions. Whereas with control constructions, the subject of a control predicate, like is reluctant, is a theta position. So they're not going to allow expletive subjects. So you will find that you cannot say it is reluctant that John will leave, where it is an expletive. Not a pronoun, where it's functioning without meaning. This is ungrammatical, and that shows us that is reluctant is a control predicate. It's also the case that control constructions disallow clausal subjects. So with is likely, we were able to move that embedded clause up, and we were able to say that John will leave is likely, but that's unacceptable with is reluctant. That John will leave is reluctant is terrible. And the reason for that is because that John will leave is not a good experiencer. And remember, reluctant requires an experiencer subject. There's a fourth test we can use, which is called the idiom test. Now, the intuition behind this has to do with the fact that when an idiom it gets its idiomatic meaning, the it has to be a single constituent at the level of LF. So there has to be, or at least at D structure, there has to be a level at which the string is all together so we can give it its special idiomatic reading. So let's take this expression, the shit hit the fan. I'm sorry it uses a rude word, but this is actually the best idiom in English to do this test with because it has the clearest judgments. If you don't want to use an idiom like this, you can use the cat is out of the bag is another option. But the interpretations are a little harder to get with that particular idiom. Now this expression has two meanings, right? It has an idiomatic meaning. For those of you who are not native English speakers, that idiomatic meaning means bad things have happened, or bad things are happening right now. If you say the shit hit the fan, that means everything went wrong. So that's one interpretation. That's its idiomatic interpretation. It also has a literal interpretation, a disgusting one, but it is a literal interpretation where excrement is hitting a fan. Now, what's at stake here is whether or not you can get the idiomatic interpretation when you stick this construction inside of either a raising or a control environment. So when you stick an idiom into a raising environment, you can retain the idiomatic reading. So the shit is likely to hit the fan means bad things are likely to happen. So it retains that idiomatic meaning. It also retains its literal meaning. And this is because at the time of before raising has happened, I mean, the shit is down here with, I'm sorry, the reason for that is because at the time of D structure, this part of the idiom is downstairs and it forms a unit to hit the fan. And then it moves up into this position. So it can have the retained idiomatic meaning. Now, the minute you put this into a control construction, the sentence loses its idiomatic meaning and becomes deeply strange. The shit is reluctant to hit the fan is odd for native speakers. Similarly, the cat is reluctant to be out of the bag, loses its idiomatic meaning. The easiest interpretation is only the literal interpretation. And the reason for that is because in control constructions, this subject is there from the beginning. It's getting a theta roll from reluctant. And the reason we use this particular idiom is because the shit is a very poor experiencer. So reluctant assigns an experiencer role to its subject, and the shit is not a very likely experiencer. So the interpretation of this can only be a literal interpretation where the shit has some kind of emotional bearing and it doesn't want to be thrown against the fan. And that is a very odd interpretation. So we lose the idiomatic meaning. So we can use this idiom test to distinguish between control constructions and raising constructions. We can see that if it retains the idiomatic meaning, it's a raising construction. If it loses the idiomatic meaning, then it is a control construction. We also can test this by working out the theta grids, by checking to see if expletive subjects are allowed or whether clausal subjects are allowed. And if once you've done these 4 tests, you should be able to distinguish raising from control constructions. Okay, let's talk about where the missing subject is in control constructions. So in the sentence, John is reluctant to leave, John is getting a theta roll from reluctant, but it also appears to be getting a theta roll from leave. This is an explicit violation of the theta criterion because DPs are supposed to receive 1 and only 1 theta roll. We seem to be missing a DP that's functioning as the subject of to leave. Now, what's the linguist's favorite way of dealing with stuff that's missing? We propose there's null things. And that's precisely what we're going to do here. we're going to propose that there is a null subject of leave. And this null subject we call pro, written in capital letters. The reason we write this in capital letters is because later in this video series, you're going to learn about pro written with lowercase letters, because linguists are bad at distinguishing things, so we often use capital letters. So this is capital pro, also known as big pro. It's called big pro because it's in all capitals. And big pro will function as the missing subject. And when we do this, we will no longer have a theta criterion violation, because John will get an experiencer theta role from reluctant, and pro will get an agent theta role of leave. Now, pro is going to function like a pronoun. So it's going to be able to be co-indexed with John to get the meaning where John is both leaving and John is reluctant. So the reason it's pro is for pronoun, because it's connected. Now, pro is null. Obviously, you never hear it. The second thing you'll notice about it is it's caseless. And it has to be caseless because there is no case on these on the specifier of non-finite 2. So the reason why it's null, it is claimed, is because it has to appear in a position without case. So this is the one exception to the case filter. It's a DP without case. But because it's null, that's going to be okay. So let's look at a tree. Okay. So what we have here is the underlying structure of the sentence, John is reluctant to leave. This is a control construction. And if we look at our construction right here, John is going to be generated just for ease of structure. I put it in here as the specifier of reluctant. If you wanted to put a kind of voice phrase in here, you could do that too. But it's going to get its experiencer role in this position. Pro, which is the agent of leave, is getting its theta role down here. So we have two DPs because we have two theta roles. It's just this one happens to be null. Now the higher DP is going to have to get case. It gets case by moving to the specifier of the TP, where it will check the EPP and get nominative case from the finite T. In the embedded clause, we're also going to move this DP into the specifier of the TP, but it doesn't do it for case reasons. Pro doesn't need case because it's null. So it's going to move into this position, but it does so vacuously because, among other things, you can't hear it. But we want it to move into this position because of the EPP. If the EPP holds, we really do want to put the DP here anyway, even though we don't hear this movement and we have no overt evidence for this movement. So that's our friend pro. In the next video, we're going to talk about subject-to-object raising, which is similar to subject raising, and we're going to talk about object control, which is similar to what's going on here. Then in the final video in this chapter, we're going to talk about the indexing relationships between pro and the nouns it refers to.